Welcome to another edition of Moore's Throwing Out Some Heavy Light. My name is Aljamal Bindon, and with me today in the studio is Dr. Patrick Valasquez, who I've been knowing for many years. And we've also had a series of conversations on our Moore program to bring out issues related to race and ethnicity, as well as dealing with issues of culture and how we can talk more about helping bring people to the fold of challenging institutions. Dr. Velasquez is he's going to tell a bit more about himself, but a retired PhD administrator at the university in San Diego. He'll talk more about that. And I had a chance to read his paper that I thought was excellent. And as part of Moore's understanding what we do, we have folks who can talk about various issues to deal with issues. But his paper is written, "The Status of San Diego's Chicano Latinos in Higher Education, Resistance Against Racism 2021 brown paper." And I was interested to use the term brown paper versus white paper as opposed to black paper, but it's very interesting how you put that. I read his paper and he's raised a number of questions and issues that require more discussions. And we will deconstruct it hopefully and make it plain for grassroots or grass tops in our community, our viewers of this program. Malcolm X used to constantly use the phrase, make it plain, which is a way of deconstructing and making people, help people understand issues for the common and real folks. So Dr. Vasquez, welcome to our program and give a little overview on yourself.
So I'm a retired Chicano educator, third generation Chicano. My grandparents immigrated from Mexico many years ago. And I was born and raised in Omaha, Nebraska. I lived there for over 30 years and graduated from the University of Nebraska, earned a master's degree there as well, and then moved to San Diego, California, which is not liberal California much at all. It's actually very conservative, not as bad as Omaha, but still pretty conservative. And so I've been here for another over 30 years. And while I was here, I earned my PhD, and I spent 28 years working at the University of California at San Diego campus. So it's one of the layers of public higher education here in California. And when I was there, I taught courses, actually taught some courses that dealt with critical race theory and racism in higher education. And I also was an administrator. I think, as you said, I was administrator in student affairs during that time too. And then I've been retired for about 4 years. I'm still serving as the co-chair of a community organization now. It's called the Chicano Latino Concilio, or Council on Higher Education for San Diego. And again, as you said, we're the organization that issued the brown paper on higher education for Latinos in San Diego.
From my perspective, the paper provides a blueprint of how post-secondary institutions should address Chicanos or Latino studies or students in post-secondary education. The papers offer a paradigm that depicts as if we're successful with students, we must deal with racism and the historical oppression of Chicanos and Latinos in the United States. Is that your assessment or summation of the paper? And maybe get a little bit more on this paper for us.
Yeah, there's a bigger context to the paper. We actually, as a Concilio, as an organization, decided that we really need to try to see what the status is of Chicanos in higher education in San Diego. So within San Diego County, there's a San Diego County, just like Douglas County includes Omaha. So San Diego County includes the city of San Diego and several other subdivisions, public subdivisions. And within the San Diego County, we have one University of California system. We have 3 universities, you could say. One is the University of California campus, and we have 2 California state campuses. And then we have 8 community colleges. So they serve a little bit like Omaha's Metropolitan Community College. So, they have different levels of access. Anybody that lives in California can attend the California community colleges. So access is not really an issue there. But the 4-year universities are very selective. And especially the University of California, San Diego has been, since its beginning, a very elitist, racist institution that has very biased admission criteria. And as a result, the numbers of Black students and Chicano students at that campus are far less than what you would predict looking at our populations in California. So we wanted to see on a comprehensive level how are Chicano students doing in all these public colleges and universities? And I want to emphasize they're public, so they're run with tax dollars, and they're supposed to be accountable to our community as well as the public at large. And so we didn't really have a way of determining, if our students have access to these institutions, if once they get there, once they get through the door, are there programs and services that support them? Um, One of the things that we noted in the paper was all these academic scholarship on Chicanos in higher education, and the same, I'm sure there's a parallel for the scholarship on Blacks in higher education that describes almost all public colleges and universities in the United States as being Eurocentric institutions. They were all built on the Eurocentric model of white culture embedded in these institutions. So our students tend to not feel a great sense of comfort when they're there. So we wanted to know what kind of programs and support our students are getting. And I know for many years I've met some people that think that all you need to do to have equity is to get Chicanos and other students of color in the door, get them out the door with a diploma, and it doesn't matter what they learned or even if they learned anything while they were there. But people in our communities are saying, there's a lack of equity, there's a lack of socioeconomic mobility in Chicano communities, and so we need leadership. When our young people graduate from college, if they don't know who they are, if they don't know the communities that they came from, if they don't know their own community's history, then that's a loss, not just for them, but for all of us in the community. So we wanted to know, what's the status of Chicano studies, Chicano academic curriculum? Are students learning anything meaningful? And also, we know again from the scholarly literature that it makes a difference if there are Chicano conscious Chicano faculty teaching in our colleges and universities. And not just in Chicano studies, but in STEM courses and humanities courses, all kinds of social science courses. So we decided, that the institutions themselves will never do a report that focuses on how well they're serving Chicano students. They won't do that. And even if they did, I don't think we could really trust them to do that. So we had to undertake the task as an organization of doing that report ourselves. And some of our members argued very strongly that before we can produce data and information on what's happening in these colleges and universities, we need to tell the public who we are as a concilio, as an organization. We need to tell people, look, we're not just talking, we're not just shooting from the hip, we're not making things up when we talk about what colleges and universities should be doing. That there's a history, of 50 years or more of intense academic scholarship on what it is that helps to make Chicano students successful in all levels of education. And so we said, we really need, as you said, to make it clear, man, to break it down and to put it on a basis our community can access and say, okay, this is what the literature says about what our colleges and universities should be doing. So if we're all as a community investing our tax dollars in community colleges and four-year universities, they need to be accountable to our community too. They need to serve our students and do it effectively according to what the academic scholarship says. So this is basically what the brown paper is a summary of the research and a little bit of the theory on facilitating success among Chicano Latino students.
Pat, I'm gonna switch up a bit, or as they call it, audible, in terms of your paper and your actual practice as an academician or a person who works with students directly. And the question is, did you experience that when you started the University of Nebraska in Nebraska and Omaha, or wherever you started? I'm not sure exactly where it's Lincoln or Omaha. And then secondly, in your years of work at the university there in San Diego, did you notice a difference between those Latino Chicano students who come in the door and those who went back out to the community? So what you're basically saying, if the system doesn't provide this culture affiliation or sense of pride in being a Chicano in the community, when they get through, they run out as individuals and they don't come back and help our respective communities. So what has been your practical experience, not only you personally, but also your experience of dealing with students in your location?
You know, when I was teaching students at UC San Diego, one of the things we used to talk about was this concept of the dialectic. And I know Huey Newton, the great Black Panthers leader, used to talk about the dialectic. And some of the students found it a hard concept to understand, but one of the points is more, it's more than this, but one of the principles of the dialectic is you can have a very racist space, a very racist institution, but within that space, you will sometimes find people that can see the contradictions in that space and they will resist. And so you can find spaces or sites of resistance even within a racist institution. So my first 2 years at UNO, University of Nebraska at Omaha, you know, I just kind of staggered around, not really knowing what I was doing. I didn't have a major.
Use the word stagger.
Yeah, that's what it felt like. I was just stumbling around for 2 years with no major, didn't know what I was going to do, and then I was fortunate at the end of my second year, I took a course in sociology, and it was probably one of the only courses I would guess on campus that talked about um, theories of collective behavior and structural inequality. So before that, I used to think, well, man, people who commit crimes, they have some kind of pathological personality, or people that are poor, it's their fault. You know, there's some weaknesses that they have. It's an individual failing. And of course, you know, I was living in North Omaha, but most of my family lived in the Chicano community in South Omaha. So I had family that were poor, and I had family that were criminals that were locked up. And even so, again, I tended to blame the victims there. But the sociology course, for the first time in my life, made me think about things a different way. That if society is structured to have inequality and to produce inequitable outcomes, that's what's going to happen. And criminal behavior is a part of that. Poverty is a part of that. And so it really blew me away. And I decided from that point on, I wanted to look further and try to do something about this, try to, as one of my mentors used to say, try to improve the human condition. So I decided to major in social work. And so I ended up graduating with a degree in social work. The social work department was also very racist. And we used
It
to
still
talk
is,
about
by the
that.
way, it still is.
Yeah, I don't doubt it. We used to talk about that because we said, you know, there was a handful of us majors in the department that were Chicanos or Blacks and Native Americans. And we used to say, man, the whole curriculum is designed to teach white people how to deal with people of color. And we're not being taught how to deal with white racism that much. And so I was disillusioned with the major by the time I graduated. But part of being in the major, I ended up being in a social work class with the chair of the Chicano student organization at UNO, which at that time was called La Causa. And so he pulled me in, and that organization was the most important part of my college education. From there, I got involved directly in the Chicano community. From there, I became an activist. I got on the board of directors of this Chicano organization. And so that was my socialization in higher education. Again, they kept me stone ignorant for 2 years. And and of course, I was already that after 13 years of public schooling, right? I went through K through 12 in the Omaha public schools, came out ignorant as a rock, and then that perpetuated another 2 years, and then I finally woke up, you know. But it wasn't anything that I did.
Right, it woke up. I like that.
Yeah, it was just the good fortune of being in again, one of these dialectical spaces where people were resisting, where people could see the contradictions and all the inequality in society and at UNO itself.
Patrick, in your paper, you talk about the brutality and lynching of Chicanos in the United States by whites and the racial hierarchy in the pre-20th century. Why is that not discussed in the literature? Now, Ida B. Wells was a famous journalist, documented and wrote about at least 5,000 lynchings of African Americans. And if you talk to Malcolm and other folks, they would say it's probably higher than that because these racists hid it and they didn't walk around documenting when they tortured and castrated Black men or cut out the fetuses and the babies of Black women. There are documentations of that happening. And also there is a book that is, that talks about akin to slavery and lynching in the United States, where they show actual postcards and pictures that these racists used to send when they kill people. And I don't think there's ever in the history of the United States a racist that was ever brought to trial. But I don't know much about lynchings of Latinos or Chicanos. Talk to me about that, because you don't hear that. You only hear about African Americans, and particularly pre-slavery or enslavement times and right after, to hold us in place and to terrorize and torture us and traumatize us so that we can act the way many of these people act today. So talk to me about this, the brown folks or Latinos or Chicanos. How did that happen, and what was that all about? Because I don't know much about that.
That's a long discussion potentially, but one of the things that we cited in our Concilio Brown paper is this book called Cruelty as Citizenship, How Migrant Suffering Sustains White Democracy by a Latina scholar named Cristina Beltran. And she goes into depth in the book. There's other scholars that have talked at great length about this. Rodolfo Acuna, who wrote the book Occupied America, The History of Chicanos, which is a great title for Chicano history in the United States, Occupied America. And, it started with the white people in the South that wanted to annex Texas. They wanted Texas to be another slave state so that the slave states would be in the majority of the United States. This was before the Civil War. This was in the 1840s or so. And so, long story short, they took over Texas. It's dealt with in short form, I guess you could say, in the excellent documentary. I think you and I have talked about this. I don't remember the gentleman who made the 4-part documentary, I think, on HBO that was called Exterminate All the Brutes.
Oh, yeah, yeah.
And there's a segment in that where he briefly talks about the Alamo. Everybody's heard of the Alamo in Texas. And in our history, the way I was taught as a child was that the American heroes, the white patriots, were defending the Alamo against the evil Mexicans. But these guys were trying to take over Texas, which was a part of Mexico. And so, they lost the Alamo, but eventually those folks, the white Texans, were able to basically steal Texas away from Mexico. And they really created a war. The United States declared war on Mexico. Abraham Lincoln went to jail for a brief time protesting against the war against Mexico. And so there's a lot of historical details that are interesting that we just, for the most part, don't know about. We're not taught. And as to why, well, it's the same reason why you see all these reactionary people arguing against teaching critical race theory. They don't want anybody to know that stuff, man.
Which is history. The analogy I use is, can you imagine in Nazi Germany, the Germans literally trying to erase that part of what they did to the Jews in the Holocaust? Again, slavery is not worse, because you had millions of Africans who were enslaved and dragged from their homelands and worked for 450 years between enslavement and Jim Crow, and you're going to erase all that history and have us walk around here brainwashed and dumber than rocks? I want to switch up, if I can, and ask you, you use the term, you define whiteness as an ideology. What does that really mean?
Well, this again is, there are a number of ethnic studies scholars who have dealt with this, and the quote that talks about that in the book, or in the Brown paper, is again from Cristina Beltran's book. And it has to do, conceptually with the idea that that whiteness was constructed back at that time, during the time of the Civil War, Black slavery, the extermination and the land theft of Native Americans' land, and the brutality against Chicanos, the lynching and complete takeover. What I think people often, it's amazing to me, even here in California, very few people seem to understand that California used to belong to Mexico. Mm-hmm. And all the southwestern states of California, Arizona, New Mexico, Texas, parts of Colorado, Nevada, that was about half of Mexico's national territory. And when the United States created the war with Mexico and won, they forced Mexico to sign a treaty that gave up half of their national territory. I've since read something I wasn't aware before, that when that happened, the president, who was James Polk at the time, he and his cabinet had a long discussion about, how much territory should we steal from Mexico? And there were a lot of voices in the room apparently that said, well, let's just take it all. Like we beat them in war, let's just take all their land. And the only reason that didn't happen apparently is because there were some white people there that said, you know what, if we take all of Mexico's land, eventually all those Mexicans are going to become US citizens. We don't want that many Mexicans in the United States. So it's bad enough that there's some living on this territory we're stealing, but we'll deal with them. And so this was the era when whiteness was really constructed as an identity. And the idea, of course, is that white people are superior and they have the God-given right or manifest destiny to be able to occupy the entire, basically all the territory we know now as the United States, the expression from sea to shining sea. And so that was the ideology. One of the things, again, I used to teach students was that ideology is a set of ideas, right? It's a set of ideas. And when ideology becomes so strong and it saturates the consciousness so much, then it becomes what we call hegemony. And hegemony is a set of ideas that's what maintains oppression, right? If you look at all the structural and systemic racism, people might ask, well, how does that stay in place? How come people don't overthrow that? Because hegemony teaches us or conditions us to believe that it's natural. And part of that ideology is, again, that, the world is the way it is and the United States is the way it is because it's just common sense and natural. And white people earned everything that they have, that there's a meritocracy in the United States, there's equal opportunity. And people like you and I just haven't worked hard enough. And that's why our communities are in such poor condition. So this is the ideology of whiteness. And again, it's been a damn near 200-year process of constructing that. And as you can see, the battle rages on. Again, when you see what's going on with critical race theory in our schools now, it seems, again, this is the dialectic, it seems at times like maybe we're making progress. For a while, Jamal, you and I remember back in the 80s when we were working on the idea of multicultural education and trying to get it infused in the Omaha public schools. And as we looked at the country then, it seemed like this was happening, right? There were consultants, there were people teaching districts all over the country how to become more multicultural. And now we're like going completely backwards with, at least with the Republican, or I think you used to say the Repelican Party, right? That doesn't want critical race theory or anything dealing with the teaching of racism.
As you alluded to that, it comes to mind as who you have teaching even cultural studies or anything related to race courses. And I remember being invited to a white student's or white teacher, professor. She told me she was at the right place at the right time. And they had her teaching in the counseling department dealing with diversity, and she had never taught before. I think she had adopted a Black kid, but when I went to her class, I could see it was lightweight. And again, I think I was critical of her somewhat because she said to me privately, I'm just a few steps in front of these students. I've never done this. And again, we all have to start somewhere. But she had no history in the Black community. She had no credibility. She had no sense of scholarship. She just happened to overhear that they were looking for a teacher as an adjunct. And so, I have not seen much come out of the university in terms of leaders and the things that you and I are talking about. And you and I remember we did the multicultural OPS, or the Omaha Plantation Schools, where they used the Cherokee people sung by Paul Revere and the Raiders as Native American music. I mean, we just started laughing. And, I see even now they had the Minnesota Humanities coming here, make at least a few $1 million teaching teachers about culture or whatever. But you look at the end results, again, you look at the empirical data, and we're not producing the leadership, and you're not even producing the pushback. As this critical race theory thing has been waged or talked about in the United States, and particularly Nebraska, the very people who teaching it or talking about it should be front and center. And as the actual fact, they're scared and they're running with their tails between their legs because they're changing things that they had in their documents in Lincoln. And the people who are doing the press conference, it's obvious they haven't read it, but it just shows you that you're right, we're going backwards. I was surprised in your paper, you define critical race theories, which you've talked about before, but also one of the founders were Richard Delgado, I think, a Mexican American, a Chicano who is in his 80s, and apparently he's catching a lot of threatening attacks. I understand his wife is white, but a lot of white folks are attacking this Chicano, who's a scholar, an elderly man who's produced some wonderful literature to help our people grow. Talk to me about that concept of scholarship or people at that level getting attacked by some of these January the 6th races that we see running around in leadership positions and in public policy jobs.
That's part of the process. I think I would guess or speculate that Delgado probably feels good in some ways about this, that when you consider the source of who's attacking him, that's a sign that he's doing the right thing. And my understanding of Richard Delgado was that he was part of the movement within the field of legal studies that really developed critical race theory. And so, it's not surprising, again, in the current context that he's getting attacked. It started in legal studies, but it definitely jumped to the field of education and also to higher education. So there are a number of people in my field in higher education that are doing critical race theory work. A man that I know a little bit, longtime professor at UCLA, Daniel Solorzano, is one of the foremost people, scholars of critical race theory in higher education and its applicability to higher education. And so, their scholarship is being attacked. But if you talk to most of the people, I would guess, that are critics of critical race theory, they couldn't even define it for you. They couldn't tell you what the elements are. And when you know how it is when these things happen, it's like when in the Tucson Unified School District, when they outlawed Chicano studies, there's a state law that outlawed Chicano studies, made it against the law to teach Chicano studies. You can believe that. And one of the people who spearheaded the attack on Chicano studies became part of the state legislature and then became the superintendent of public instruction there. So some of these white folks have found a way to exploit all this racism and paranoia and xenophobia. And so you've got politicians now, almost all of them white, that are running on a platform of, I'm going to keep critical race theory out of the school. Elect me, I will fight against critical race theory. And it doesn't even exist in K through 12 curriculum. It's not even there, and there's no intention to put it there. California just passed a state law that makes ethnic studies mandatory in high schools in California, but it's not critical race theory or anything like it. It's probably closer to the, Cherokee people multicultural education we worked on and we criticized in the 1980s. So again, it's like these politicians that have made a career for themselves, promising their white brothers and sisters that they're going to keep Mexican immigrants out of the United States. And so there you have it, man. That's our society.
Patrick, in your paper and the academic literature, Chicano and Latino students do well in post-secondary institutions when exposed to people who look like them. I've heard them talk about that in high school, grade school, and you heard all these institutional buffoons and these functionaries talk about, we want our schools to look like our community. And we also hear people in administrative positions in government and elsewhere say, we want to be a good cross-section representing the community, and so on and so on. And my question is when you look in terms of the historical culture, when you look in terms of all the things that we've talked about people who look like them, drill down on those steps for me. It should be able to, one of the things I'm trying to say is you have a graph and you talk a bit more about that, but why is that so important for people in institutions to look like the very people they teach or they work with and so on? Talk to me a little about that. And then you have a diagram in your paper that you talk about that where you deconstruct a little bit more, but talk to me a little about that.
There's at least a couple of strands of scholarly literature that talk about this. And again, I think people have been describing this for decades, but one scholar, a Chicana named Laura Rendon, has developed a concept that she calls validation. And she says, if you look at successful Chicano students in college, you will find that they have experienced multiple forms of validation. This is not a panacea. It's not the only thing they need to be successful. but this is somebody or sometimes something that provides support, direct support, assurance, and just validates for Chicano students that they belong on the campus. So you can imagine if the same phenomena obviously exists for Black students and Native American students, but if you live in a barrio, if you live in a Chicano community where 80 to 90% of the people are Mexican like you, and you go to the University of California, San Diego campus, where maybe, you know, 20% of the students are Chicano, you're going to be looking all over the place for students or somebody or something that looks like you. And man, for 28 years, I heard those stories of Chicano freshmen at UC San Diego who would tell me, Patrick, I'm living in a suite with 15 students and I'm the only Chicano there. I'm scared to play my Mexican music because people look at me funny or they laugh at me or they say, what the hell is that? And so you know, it's the same thing again. I had Black students year after year that would tell me, Patrick, I've got a chemistry class with 300 students in a lecture, and I'm the only Black student there. So, and with the lack of critical mass of students like themselves, they begin to doubt whether they belong there and whether they can be successful there. So something or someone has to validate them and remind them continuously, support them, and remind them that they belong there and they can be successful. And that's the role that socially conscious Chicano faculty can play.
Pat, just to interrupt you here. You talk of this program or this situation. Your experience with the Goodrich program in Omaha, where they brought students together as a cohorts, would that address the issue when students of color, particularly Latinos, Chicanos, are in the minority? If you did something like that, brought them in as a cluster and have them take classes as a group, would that help address that? Or are you talking something a little bit bigger than that?
Yeah, that's the Goodrich program. And I worked in the Goodrich program for 2 years as a graduate assistant. It's what there's another scholar named Richard Ibarra who wrote a really compelling book 21 years ago. He wrote it. It was called Beyond Affirmative Action. And he was saying, you know, all these, what he called pipeline programs, like the Goodrich Scholarship Program, or the one that I worked at for 28 years at UC San Diego called Oasis, that these pipeline programs are good, but they can only help a limited number of students, right? And what they're trying to do is ultimately help the students cope with the racist institutional culture. And in the book, he talks about why colleges and universities are the way they are. He talks about how they were initially adapted from the British model of universities. That's how Harvard and the other Ivy League colleges started. But then the German research model came into vogue in the United States. And that's what's copied now by so many colleges and universities. And so, again, because the institutional culture is different than the culture of students of color, they're going to feel a sense of alienation and want to get out as fast as they can. So these programs like Goodrich and Oasis that are started to help the students often do a really good job, but they're usually underfunded or almost always underfunded. So they can only serve a small number of students. And meanwhile, the majority of the Chicano students or Black students are out there trying to negotiate this minefield all by themselves. And many of them are getting blown up by the mines. And those are the ones that drop out. And unfortunately, we never hear from them again.
You know, as you mentioned, you would think the university with this push out rate, I know Bellevue University has they call it a paper mill where you got more students going in, but rare students graduating on a higher level, particularly students of color. You would think they would have some kind of external survey or some kind of follow-up longitudinal study on how well they're doing and so on. But I don't know of any institutions who really deal with their graduates or alumni, except as to exploit them and try to give more money. So that'd be something we should deal with. In your paper, you define this multi-contextual model for delivery learning environment. And then you have a diagram. I'm sorry, I can't show that, but kind of walk me through why that sequence or that is so important. And then break it down a little bit more on what each one of those steps mean. I know you do that in the paper, but you do have I think it's like 5 different steps and so on there.
Yeah, that model was developed mainly by another Chicana scholar, longtime scholar at UCLA, named Silvia Hurtado. And Hurtado developed this model trying to account for all the factors and variables that affect the success of the possible success of Chicano students and other students of color in college or university. And so she tried to make the model as comprehensive as possible. And again, as I talked about, you've got 50 years or more of scholarship on what makes Chicano students successful. So she's tried to synthesize all this and create a model that any institution can look at and say, okay, this is what we need to construct. If we want to be a university of the 21st century with equity and diversity, and we want our students of color to be successful, again, this could work, this could be applicable anywhere, but I think the urgency is especially great in a state like California, where whites are in the minority in the state. And so the model tries to account for just about anything that could affect the experiences of students. And it talks about how important the student's identity is. So again, if you're talking about Chicano students, their identity, their knowledge of who they are, that's an important part of going to college and being successful, that you're not likely to be successful if you don't know who the hell you are. Because if you don't know who you are, then you don't know why you're there.
Well, Patrick, let me interrupt you and ask you this specific, because it has this 5 levels. It says social historical context, policy context, institutional context, climate for diversity, and the last one says community context and external commitments. So my point is, it looks like you start at the top and go down, but somebody will look at it different, say maybe that community context is the foundation, but I can't make sense of it. But this is sequential you have to go through to make it a healthy institution. Again, you're talking about San Diego, and one of my questions was, does this also apply to all post-secondary institutions?
Yeah, I think it does apply to all of them. And it's a matter of, I think, just being conscious, and in your strategies for success, being conscious of, again, everything that could impact you. So she deals with these very powerful forces outside of the university. Sometimes we might think, well, you got an institution like UNO, it can decide whatever it wants to do. But again, we can see, as you talked about with this UNL so-called equity plan or whatever, strategic plan, that there are bigger forces outside the university that impact it. So for instance, in 1996 here in California, the voters passed a law that outlawed affirmative action. So this didn't happen inside universities, it happened outside in the public sphere at a society-wide level. So what's happening in society, and again, look at critical race theory, what's happening with that, that can shape or at least impose pressure on the university or any post-secondary institution. So you've got that layer, and that includes policy issues that she talks about. And again, you've got the community level, so you've got to keep conscious of the kinds of communities that are sending students to your institution. And if you want to be successful, for example, with Chicano students, you want to have a relationship with the Chicano community off campus as well. This is one of the great failings of the University of California, San Diego, that they were so isolated that they had no real communication with Chicanos outside of the campus. And so you've got that, and then the model moving into the institution talks about all these important factors like having diverse curriculum, ethnic studies, Black studies, Chicano studies, having, again, as we talked about, diverse faculty, Black faculty, Native American faculty, Chicano faculty, and also administration. Again, I hate to keep going back to my old campus, but University of California, San Diego, I think started in 1960. At any given time, they have about 10 vice chancellors. So there must have been something like 1,000 vice chancellors hired at that campus during its existence. And during that time, there's been one Chicano vice chancellor. So when the leadership of the institution gets together to meet and determine its policies and what they're going to do to serve students, there's not one Mexican voice in that room, not one. And again, I'm not talking about Omaha or Maine. I'm talking about San Diego, California, about a 15-minute drive from the border with Mexico. So you've got to have a diverse administration and leadership. All these things have to be in place to maximize the success of the kinds of students that we're talking about.
You know, you in your paper you use a term called HSI,
Mhm.
and it's an unfamiliar term to me. It's called Hispanic Serving Institution, and it sounds like from reading it's similar to historical Black colleges, HBC. Yet in your definition, it means something like so many percentages of the student body are Chicanos, Latino. Again, a new concept for me. But why is that important? HSI or Hispanic Serving Institution, and what is exact numbers they need to be defined as that?
Yeah, I would say it's potentially important, although oftentimes it's nothing but symbolism is a reality, but it has potential importance, I believe. So it's been probably back to the early 90s when institutions, and some Chicanos that worked in higher education were pushing for something like um, historically Black colleges and universities, or something that would make the federal government pay more attention to those institutions that were educating a lot of Chicano students. So they said, look, why don't we come up with this federal designation? If you're a college or a university and 25% at least of your student enrollment is they call it Hispanic, but Chicano Latino, let's say, of Mexican or Latin American background, um, Hispanic really means Spanish. In Spain, the last time I looked was in Europe, not Latin America. So it really is referring to white people, not Mexicans or Chicanos. But they were so, brainwashed, I guess, they came up with this concept of Hispanic. And so they asked the federal government, can you create this designation? And then if you designate these institutions based on their enrollment as HSIs, Hispanic Serving Institutions, then they can apply for grants to get money from the federal government to help them serve Chicano students more effectively. Sounds good, right? Conceptually, it all sounds good. And the fact of it is that a lot of the institutions, if not most or almost all, that had these high enrollments of Chicano students were not doing anything to serve them or to help them succeed once they got through the door. And so this became a big point of contention. More and more Chicanos scholars begin to say, wait a minute, man, like we've got this HSI program now. And I believe they also have one now for Native Americans and Asian Americans, Pacific Islanders. So we've got these federal programs, and there's this bucket or basket of federal money set aside that these programs can apply for to serve Chicano students more effectively. But are they really doing anything substantive with it? And again, are they just building this enrollment or letting the enrollment happen and then saying, hey, look at us, man, like we're so good, we're so equitable. We got 30% Chicano enrollment. And again, this could be at a state where the enrollment should be closer to 40%.
As you mentioned that, one of the things I always look as the outcome, or as they say, reverse engineering. If you look at our communities, even though some folks get these so-called degrees or advanced degrees, whatever, you never see them come back. I mean, you got people in our communities who have no allegiance to anything, and some of them have actually got scholarships or free rides, some of them. And again, once they go inside the door, they just become like Muppets or puppets or, bobbleheads. And
Well,
it's obvious what happens.
that doesn't, I don't think it happens by accident. To me, that's the deliberate outcome of a lot of these programs that go through HSIs. So again, if I'm a shrewd white racist professor of engineering at UC San Diego, I can write a grant to the federal government and get money to supposedly support Hispanic students in engineering. And when that grant comes in, could be for millions of dollars, I get to take 2% off the top in what's called indirect costs. There might be more than that, but at least 2%. And that goes into my slush fund for conferences and travel and who knows what else I want to spend it on. And meanwhile, I just hire some people and set up this little program for students and give them tutoring or something to help them in their engineering courses. But the one thing that program would never do is have a leadership development component or a social consciousness component that helps the students develop a commitment to social justice. Because what it should say is, look, okay, you want to become an engineer, that's fine. Your community as a Chicano student expects you to be a leader and a change agent for that community. So we want to teach you about Chicano studies, Chicano history and culture. So you know who the hell you are again. When you get out, you can be an effective change agent. But a lot of these STEM departments have started programs that completely lack that. And so now you've got this whole cadre, especially here in California. San Diego has a big biotech industry. And I used to see this over and over again with Chicano students at the university where I worked, where they would knock themselves out for 4 years to get a college degree in biology. They get hired by a biotech firm. The firm would slap a white coat on them and say, here, you sit in this room and pour liquids from test tubes back and forth for 8 hours a day, or you do stuff with rats, white rats. And so what it provides an income and benefits, I suppose, for the students themselves or former students. But again, the question is, how does that benefit the collective?
Right. And that's the essence of the conversation.
Yes, because Chicanos are not just a community that happens to be culturally different than the dominant group, but we're what's considered a subordinate group.
Right.
We don't have political power. We don't have economic power. Our educational achievement is low. We're overrepresented in prisons and so forth. And so our communities need leadership, man, and they need.
And you would think there would be a course offered on leadership, and they would have some practical examples that they've done their lead. And I also look at some of these appointed leaders or these so-called elected leaders, and some of these sometimes de facto leaders who really don't lead. In other words, to lead, you have to have followers, and you have to actualize something that comes out of the benefits of masses, and that doesn't always happen. Patrick, I always wonder, how do you put your paper concepts in operation? Do we have enough folks in our community in both the commitment and cognitive function to understand the merits of the theories that you moving forward in terms of helping Black and brown folks coming out of the academic brainwashing educational cesspool? So for example, what you just shared, how do we operationalize some of that so it can be real for our respective communities?
Yeah, man, that's a real challenge. Again, what we hope to do is come out with part 2 of this brown paper early next year. And we have been collecting data and information from, again, all 11 of these public higher education institutions in San Diego. We sent them a whole list of all the data and information we wanted. And one of the presidents, well, actually, he's the chancellor of a whole community college district here. And he told me, frankly, he said, when we got that request, it scared us a little bit because we're wondering, like, what are you going to do with this? And also, it's a lot of work for us to get all this information for you. And I said, I thought that these institutions would have this data and information right there. Because don't they want to know how good of a job they're doing serving Chicano students? Isn't that important to them? And so I almost felt like we were doing them a favor by helping them to focus on that. In any case, we want to write this report summarizing and analyzing all the data and information they send us. And then we have to get to the question you're asking, like, how do we get this to our community? How do we get this to Chicanos throughout San Diego? And one of the challenges we have, man, is we don't have access to media. I sent out this brown paper with a press release to all the media outlets, or at least most of them in San Diego, and virtually none of them expressed any interest in it. And if you pick up the daily, this is unbelievable, the size of San Diego. We have one daily newspaper in San Diego, one, the San Diego Union Tribune. That's it. And I mean, it's like Omaha, right? With the Omaha World Herald. And the San Diego Union Tribune historically has been damn near as bad as the Omaha World Herald in terms of ignoring communities of color. So they didn't have any interest at all. And when I pick up that paper and look at it, man, they have the most ridiculous, trivial announcements and stories in that paper every day. And they didn't want to publish one line about an organization that's trying to focus on Chicano student success. So we've got to find some way to hold the media accountable. It's harder because they're not public. The media is all private. So we need to find some way to get the word out through them. And it's a challenge also because the Chicano community in a place like San Diego is not monolithic. You've got one segment of the community that doesn't speak English. You've got another segment of the community that doesn't speak Spanish, or is very dominant in English. And you've got some community people that are very progressive, that are trying to fight and strive for, again, the collective progress of Chicanos. And you've got some that are just out there trying to survive every day. And so trying to get people to say, wait a minute, can you hold on for a second and pause your life for a few minutes to think about what we're saying about the status of our children and our Chicano students in higher education. So we have to strategize more on ways to do that. One thing I'll say, Jamal, I think I've talked to you about this before in these dialogues, is one of the most disappointing and frustrating parts of this whole battle is the abject ignorance and apathy of our Chicano elected officials in San Diego. So we don't have a unicameral like Nebraska. We've got two houses of the state legislature. We have a state senate and a state assembly. And there are Chicanos from throughout California serving. They've been elected to either the assembly or the senate. And they have a Chicano, no, they don't call it Chicano, Latino legislative caucus. So it's, I guess, parallel to the Hispanic caucus that's in the United States Congress. The California Latino Legislative Caucus includes Chicanos elected to both the Assembly and the Senate in California. And we have laboriously, painstakingly sent our brown paper, all kinds of documents to these folks. We practically begged them to meet with us. We actually managed to get a Zoom meeting with one of their staff a few months ago, and he promised he would try to get us an actual audience with one of the members of this caucus. It's easier to get in to see the Wizard of Oz than it is to get to see these these legislators, man. And I don't know what they do. They have again a Latino legislative caucus, but I'm not sure what they're actually doing, what their priorities are. And man, that's one of the things that we have theorized and hypothesized about for decades, right? That if we could just get more of our own people elected to public office, we could help to shape the policy process in our society.
As you
This
mentioned
is
that,
one example where it's clearly not happening.
as you mentioned that, I had made contact with Heath Mello in Lincoln probably a few months ago. He said he was catch up with me. Never heard back from John Barlow, who's the head of CPAC. Same thing. They get in these offices, and even though they're appointed or anointed, they have no contact with people of color in our community. I mean, for example, CPACs, they created a student advisory committee with students of color. What kind of roles can they have if they're inside the system and the teachers are using the professors, the grading process over their head? It's kind of like a subjective group. So again, what good are these organizations, these institutions, picking education if they have no links into the community? And back in the day when we were going to school, at least you would see a professor every now and then in the community at an event. You never see them. Most of them coming in here, they're not even from Nebraska, and they work in these suburban environments. And they have the nerve to say that they represent groups, but you will sit in rooms and meetings and they'll never speak to La Raza or African Americans or African culture, so on. And it's just kind of unfortunate. We're down to the last few minutes, and I want to give you a chance to give some closing comments related to some of our conversation things you'd like to share with the viewing audience.
Well, again, we just have to continue to plug away. I think the issue of accountability is very important. So we have made at least some surface process. I had a brief meeting last week with this young man who's now the chancellor of the San Diego Community College District. So they have 3 credit-bearing campuses in this district, community colleges. And they hired a new chancellor, and he's a young Puerto Rican guy. Seems very progressive. And he was telling me, he said, when I first came to San Diego maybe 5 years ago. Out of all the 8 community colleges, I think he told me only 2 of them had presidents that were Latino. And now it's closer to like 5 or 6, I think. And I said, that's a great thing, but we have seen, unfortunately, the failure of Latino leadership in some of these positions over the years. And so I told him, I want to be positive. I want to be cautiously optimistic. I always applaud the fact when a Latino or a Latina is hired in a high administrative position in higher education, because I know, again, that is absolutely essential to make that institution a really functioning institution for our community, hold it accountable. And sometimes we've had good fortune, you could say, with good leadership, but it hasn't always been consistent. It's been very uneven. And again, I understand that the pressures on Black or Latino high administrative positions is great. There's so much pressure to conform. When the earliest Chicano scholarship that I read in the 1970s, in fact, when I worked with the Goodrich program, we had a Black scholar named Phil Secret. But Phil and I taught an article called "The Barrio was an Internal Colony," and it talked about the Chicano community as a colony of the United States, an internal colony. And they had built that on an article by 2 Black scholars. I think Stokely Carmichael was one of them, Charles Hamilton, the other one, who wrote an article, "The Ghetto as an Internal Colony." And so, this is unfortunately what we're dealing with. And in that literature, it talked about how sometimes our own leaders will get co-opted and bend over backwards to show that they're not giving favoritism to our people, to their own people. So that's part of the struggle. Again, there's a lot of different dimensions to it, but we have to just keep plugging away and seek transparency and accountability wherever we can.
Dr. Patrick Valasquez, I appreciate you being on the show and talking to us about the Chicano Latino experience, because too often locally we don't have that. And then again, when you hear people in leadership talk, they talk in generalities and terms that really don't make sense. And at the end of the day, it goes back to our conversation is, what are the outcomes? What are the empirical verification that we have done better? In actual fact, what they do is they talk each other in circles and don't do that. So really appreciate you coming to us, give us some light, as we say, some heavy light to help us go forward to improve our respective communities and of course, society as a whole. So we hope you can join us as another point and talk about some of the other activities you're working on, and particularly as you get your research more refined with some of the data, we can come to visit that and hopefully have some comparative analysis of what's happened in backwoods Nebraska when it comes to people of color. We know that we make up the numbers in the prison, the dropout rates and the push out and so on. So your scholarship and stuff could be very helpful for us, because we don't have a lot of Latinos, Chicanos scholars doing this kind of work.
Well, for those Chicanos in Omaha that dream or fantasize, as I once did, about escaping from Omaha, there are no utopias out here, man.
Right. Well, I found that out when I went to Africa. I learned a lot there, and I became astute on what happened. But at one point, the guy said, one of the best ways you can help us is try to help reform some of your stuff in your own home or your own community. So again, the more we have people who can advocate for our people respectively, they can make us stronger. So we hope that you've enjoyed this edition of Moore's throwing out some heavy light, and hopefully we'll bring Dr. Valasquez back again to bring some other light to us to help illuminate the way that is becoming somewhat dark looking at the political landscape today. But again, as we know our histories, it was those leaders whose shoulders we stand on that we have to continue to push back for those ones who are not yet born. So as we say, may the force be with you, Baroko.